The Library of Shadows. Books that were never meant to be read. The Door Without a Name. You find yourself standing before a heavy wooden door. Its frame hums faintly, as if whispering to itself. Above it, no title, no crest, no invitation. Just dust, silence, and the faint smell of ink gone sour. This is the Library of Shadows. A place rumored to hold every book that should never have existed. Not the lost ones, but the forbidden ones. The manuscripts burned before they could breathe, the scrolls buried beneath monasteries, the words that frightened even those who believed in nothing. The door doesn't ask for permission. It simply opens. You step inside. The air is thicker than you expected. Old parchment, beeswax, mold. The scent of centuries collapsing. A thousand shelves curve like ribs around the heart of this place. Some of the books have no titles. Some seem to be whispering. And some, disturbingly, seem to be breathing.
The book that wrote itself. In 1518, a scholar in Prague claimed that his ink pot never dried. No matter how much he wrote, it stayed full. When his servant finally opened the drawer one night, she found not an ink pot, but a hole, a black pit, swallowing light and pages and reason itself. The scholar's final words, scrawled in uneven letters, said, "The words come faster now. They no longer wait for me to think them." They found him 3 days later, surrounded by hundreds of pages, all filled with the same line, "I did not write this."
The book that resulted was said to continue writing itself, even when locked away. Later monks described hearing faint scratching sounds through the chest that held it. They called it Liber Somnorum, the Book of Dreams. Others called it the Ink of the Abyss. Some whispered that the book recorded dreams of the dead. Others believed it wrote down thoughts no human should think. Whatever it was sealed in iron and buried beneath the monastery's wine cellar, where they hoped the holy smell of fermented grapes would drown out the stench of whatever spoke through it. But ink, as it turns out, seeps through anything. The Banned Anatomy. Further down one corridor, you pass a shelf marked only by a single bone. White, smooth,
not animal. Here lie the books of forbidden anatomy. In the late Middle Ages, some physicians wanted to understand how the body and soul intertwined. They believed that every organ had a corresponding sin, that the liver stored envy, that the lungs hoarded pride, that the heart itself was a mirror for lust. And if you looked closely enough at it, you could see your own sins staring back. A Florentine surgeon once carved symbols into a cadaver's heart, claiming he could translate desire into language. He wrote an anatomy book afterward, each illustration painted in the red of the same heart he studied. The church banned it before it could be printed. Only 3 copies survived, all of them stained, not by blood, they said, but by regret. You run your hand along the shelf and feel the faint hum of them. The air tastes metallic, as if the pages remember the copper tang of what they were made for. The whispering gospel. Now, in the farthest corner, there is a book that's never been opened more than once, because those who have opened it never spoke again. It is bound in black velvet, and its cover bears no writing, only a single symbol, an eye within a circle. Scholars called it Evangelium Tacitum, the silent gospel. They say it was written by a monk who wanted to outdo God, to write a gospel purer than the divine word itself. He fasted for 40 days, slept in the chapel surrounded by candles, and claimed that angels dictated the text in a tongue older than Hebrew. When his abbot tried to read it aloud, his voice broke halfway and then never came back. They say the book contained not words, but frequencies, a rhythm of symbols that struck something deep in the human nervous system, like music played directly on the soul. It didn't destroy you exactly, it just rewrote the silence inside your head. You close the book carefully. It sighs. The candles flicker. Something shifts above you, as if the library itself just turned a page. There are some books, they say, that you do not find. They find you. You could be walking through a crowded market, your thoughts drifting like smoke, and suddenly your eyes catch a glimmer of something in the shadow of a stall. A spine that looks too old to belong there. A cover that almost seems to recognize you. You pick it up, and for a second, you could swear the air around it bends, just
slightly, like the world adjusting to your new fate. The Reader's Reflection. In 1621, a scholar from Lubeck claimed to have found a manuscript in a sealed chest aboard a shipwrecked vessel. The chest was dry, though it had clearly been underwater for weeks. Inside was a single book bound in glassine leather. The cover was blank, but when he looked closer, he realized it reflected not his face, but a slightly different version of it. Younger, perhaps, or older, or thinking something he wasn't. He opened it, and the first page read, "Welcome back." The text changed every time he read it. At first, it told him familiar stories, his own memories, written down in immaculate Latin. But then, it began writing scenes from his future, conversations he hadn't had yet, letters he had not yet sent, arguments he would regret. He tried burning it once, but the fire went out as though the flames themselves refused to touch it. He locked it in a chest and threw it into the sea. 2 years later, he received a package with no return address. Inside was the same book, still dry, still waiting. They called it The Reader's Reflection, a mirror that reads you back. The Alchemist's Codex. Deeper inside the Library of Shadows, past the section of forbidden anatomies and silent gospels, there stands a single pedestal under a dome of smoke-blackened glass. Beneath it rests the Codex of Returning. Written sometime in the 14th century, it was said to be the magnum opus of a forgotten alchemist, a man who wanted to distill eternity into ink. Each page is written with a different metal: mercury for the first, silver for the second, gold for the third, and something that shines like bone for the last. The text, when read aloud, was said to call back whatever you had lost, not metaphorically, but literally. One merchant from Bologna claimed to have read its first few pages and heard his dead wife's voice whispering from the rafters. Another swore his childhood dog appeared by his bedside that same night, covered in dust and confusion. But the alchemist warned, every return demands a replacement. You could bring something back, but something else had to go. A breath for a breath, a heart for a heartbeat, a memory for a soul. They sealed the codex after the alchemist vanished, not died, but vanished, leaving only a circle of ashes shaped exactly like a man reading.
The Library of Shadows is said to have a guardian, not a ghost, not a monk, something in between. Some call her the Quiet Keeper. Others say she's the spirit of the first librarian who cataloged the books too dangerous to destroy. She never speaks, she only listens. Scholars who claim to have seen her describe the faint rustle of pages following her footsteps. When she passes by, the whispering books fall silent, as if in respect or fear. It's said that if you stay too long in the library, you might hear her behind you, breathing softly, listening not to your words, but to your thoughts, deciding which shelf you belong to.
The book of names that erased its reader. The next shelf you reach is short, only 3 books, each with a chain around it, each locked with iron clasps. These are the books of true names. In medieval magical tradition, to know a being's true name was to have power over it. But one book, simply titled De Nominibus, was said to contain every name that ever was. Human, angelic, infernal, spoken and unspoken, dreamed and forgotten. Each time someone read their own name from the book, they ceased to exist.
Not death, just absence. Their bed would still be warm, their handwriting still visible, their reflection still there, but no one could recall their voice, their face, their laughter. Only the book would remember them, and the book, as you might imagine, does not laugh back. You wander further, past shelves where candles burn with cold flames, past tables scattered with quills still dripping with ink that never dries. At the far end is a door. It's smaller than the others, as if meant for something that once crawled, not walked. On it, carved faintly, are the words, "Scribe me, and I shall scribe you." Inside is a desk, a single chair, and hundreds of loose pages nailed to the walls, as if someone had tried to stop them from flying away. They flutter slightly when you enter, like birds disturbed. On the desk lies an open manuscript, blank, except for one line at the bottom of the page. If you are reading this, you are already being written. Your pulse slows, the air thickens. A draft turns the next page, but there is no next page. Only the faint reflection of your own shadow across the parchment.
You step back, but the page turns anyway. The scribes of the unreadable. The deeper you descend into the library of shadows, the more you realize not every book was found. Some were forged. Forged not with ink and paper, but with obsession. With trembling hands that refused to stop writing long after reason had gone quiet. There is a legend among old monasteries that somewhere in the dead hours before dawn, a monk would rise from his bed without opening his eyes. He would walk, unseeing, into the scriptorium, light no candle, and begin to write. The other monks claimed he worked faster than any man should. Pages filled themselves in minutes, lines of immaculate, impossible Latin. At sunrise, he would awaken at his desk, hands black with ink, eyes hollow. When they asked him what he wrote, he'd shake his head and say, "Not I. He writes through me." They locked his pages away in an iron chest, but when a new novice tried to burn them centuries later, the fire went cold, as if something in the text refused to vanish. They called it the Gospel of No Light, and even now, the few who've seen its fragments say that the letters move slightly, curling toward each other like vines, spelling words you almost recognize before they shift again.
The ink that dreamed. In a forgotten abbey near Rouen, a formula was whispered among scribes, ink made not from soot or gall, but from sleep. They called it atramentum somni. To create it, a monk would go 3 nights without rest, then bleed a few drops onto a sheet of vellum, whispering a prayer as he fell into dreams. When he awoke, his dreams would have taken form, transcribed in his own hand, though he swore he had not lifted the quill. This ink was said to remember things you forgot, and to write truths you tried to bury.
The manuscripts written with it were unreadable in daylight, but under the soft glow of a candle, they revealed shimmering passages in languages that looked halfway between Latin and longing. One page described an angel made entirely of eyes. Another, a city where every shadow moved on its own. After a decade, every monk who used it either went blind or refused to sleep again. But the ink still exists in tiny bottles sealed with wax whispering faintly when the moon is full. The order of the last syllable. Far from monasteries, in taverns and ruined castles, there were others who wrote, not to praise God, but to imitate Him. They called themselves the Order of the Last Syllable. They believed creation was language, that every word ever spoken was a fragment of the divine alphabet, and that to finish the alphabet was to end the world. Each member dedicated their life to discovering a single perfect word, one that would close the universe like a book snapping shut. They tattooed letters on their tongues, burned dictionaries as sacrifices, and refused to speak casually for fear that a stray word might be the one. The last of them was executed in Prague in 1497. The night before his death, he wrote one word on the wall of his cell. It was erased the next morning, not by guards, but by light, as though the sun itself wanted to swallow it whole. The archivist's candle. You can almost hear the whisper of quills from centuries ago. The faint scratch of parchment, the soft cough of dust disturbed. You pause before a small desk, a candle still flickering, though the wax has long hardened. Beside it lies a single parchment, half written, half burned. In the surviving lines, someone had written, "Do not copy the word. It copies you." The rest of the parchment is blackened, not by fire, but by something like shadow made solid. You lean closer. The blackness hums faintly. You can almost hear it breathing. The censors who couldn't forget. For every writer of forbidden books, there was also a destroyer. The Inquisition hired men called silent censors, scribes whose duty was to read and erase texts that threatened to corrupt the soul. But the human mind, it turns out, is a terrible place to store forbidden knowledge. After years of copying blasphemies, word by word, just to blot them out again, the censors began to dream in parchment and ash. One claimed he could see letters crawling across the walls of his own home. Another that he could taste ink in his bread. When one went mad, he burned down his entire monastery. And when they sifted through the ruins, the only thing left intact was a single quill, still wet, still writing in mid-air. They buried it in a lead coffin, but sometimes at night you can hear scratching from beneath the ground. The manuscript that couldn't be finished. And then there are those who tried to end their stories and failed. In Venice, a poet began writing a tragedy so perfect he swore it came to him from an angel. Every night he'd wake up and add a few more lines until the verses began finishing themselves. When he tried to stop, his hand moved without him. The ink spilled like blood. He screamed for his apprentice to take the quill away, but when the apprentice touched it, it snapped in half, and the poet fell silent. The final page remains unfinished. No one dares complete the last line, because written faintly at the bottom are the words, "Do not conclude me."
There are moments, they say, when the library of shadows forgets it is made of wood and stone. When the silence trembles, the dust seems to pulse, and the books begin to listen. It doesn't happen often, only when the air grows too heavy with secrets, when too many forbidden names have been whispered at once, and the stories start to recognize one another. That's when the library wakes. The murmuring shelves. It begins quietly, a soft rhythmic rustle, like the sound of hundreds of robes brushing together. The air smells of smoke and salt. Candles flicker, not from wind, but from attention. You can hear it now, the whisper of ink rubbing against ink, sentences shifting, rearranging themselves, as if one book is trying to correct another. The librarian used to call it the arguing. When the banned gospels debate the alchemical codices, and the grimoires mock the saints' letters for being too innocent. When each text believes it is more true than the rest. The sound builds until it's almost human, like hundreds of soft, papery voices hissing secrets to each other. And if you listen too closely, you might hear your own name, pronounced slowly, as if being tested for inclusion. The book that wandered. Once, in 1734, a night custodian claimed he saw a book move, not fall,
not slide, move. It was a heavy folio bound in blackened brass, known only as the Chronicle of Things That Refuse to Die. He swore it crawled down from its shelf and began dragging itself across the stone floor, leaving faint burn marks in its path, as if each word inside were smoldering with irritation.
When he picked it up, bravely or stupidly, he said it shuddered in his hands, then opened itself, pages turning wildly until it stopped on a passage that read, "You are late." No one saw him again after that night, but his lantern was found still burning, placed neatly beside an open bookstand. On it was the Chronicle, its pages now blank, except for one faint handprint in ash.
The Lexicon of Echoes. If you stand long enough in the hall of forgotten tongues, you might hear what sounds like language, but not quite. A babble of syllables, as if every forgotten language in history were trying to speak again through borrowed throats. That is the Lexicon of Echoes, a collection of phonetic fragments so old that no scholar has ever determined their origin. Each page contains one word, but when read aloud, the reader hears many voices, each repeating the word slightly differently, as though echoing through centuries.
Some claim the echoes are from the past, the first voices that spoke the word. Others think they're from the future, trying to correct the pronunciation. One reader described it like this: "It was not that I heard the word. It was that the word heard me."
There was once a visitor, a historian, who came to study the earliest volumes of the Codex Obscura. They found his notes days later, soaked in something black and tar-like. The words on his parchment had left the page and crawled upward, forming sentences along the wall. It read, "Why should ink lie still when the mouth that wrote it has gone?" By the time the guards arrived, the writing had reached the ceiling and then stopped. Now those same lines shimmer faintly in the lamplight, like veins of shadow still pulsing. The Catalogue of Impossible Books. Somewhere near the library's center is a small locked cabinet labeled Liber Nullus. Inside, bound in steel and dust, is a peculiar ledger. It doesn't contain books. It lists books that don't exist. Titles that were never written. Authors that were never born. Pages that were never printed.
Yet every few years, a new title appears in neat handwriting. And sometimes, a few weeks later, a real book with that title is discovered, exactly as the ledger predicted. The most recent edition appeared only months ago. The ink was still wet. It read, "The Library of Shadows, Volume 4, The Night It Woke Up." You are reading it now. The paper that breathed. In a climate-controlled vault, scholars keep a fragment known as the breathing page. At first glance, it's nothing special, just a torn scrap of vellum. But when placed under glass, the page rises and falls slowly, like the chest of someone asleep. Under certain light, faint pulse-like movements can be seen traveling along the fibers, as if veins run through it. Scientists have measured carbon, DNA, temperature, but nothing explains the heat it emits. Warm to the touch, always exactly body temperature. Some say the page remembers its writer, their heartbeat, their rhythm, their sigh, and perhaps still dreams of being finished. The Feast of Books. Once every century, or so the whispers claim, the library holds a feast, not for humans, for itself. Shelves split open like jaws, binding crackling like bone. Loose parchment slithers from table to table, pages devouring other pages, ink flowing like wine. When it's over, the floor is clean. No torn leaves, no spilled words, no trace of chaos. Only new spines where none were before. Each labeled in the same handwriting, authored by the library. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint sound of chewing beneath the marble tiles. Imagine the hour just before dawn. The lamps are dim. Your breath leaves small clouds in the still air, and the parchment before you trembles slightly, as if remembering something. We've traveled far,
through monastic vaults, whispering libraries, and forbidden rooms where the scent of mold and ink carries centuries of silence. And as we reach the end of this quiet journey, one truth has begun to take shape, slowly like a ghost forming out of smoke. Not every book was meant to enlighten. Some were meant to protect, and some were meant to warn. The grimoires of medieval magicians, bound in skin and sealed with wax, were not always acts of blasphemy. Sometimes they were desperate manuals, written by trembling hands, hoping to survive the unknown. Their authors recorded what they feared most, believing that if a demon's name was written, it could be controlled. Knowledge as a kind of exorcism.
Then there were the suppressed texts, burned by kings, hidden by priests, buried by their own creators. The Book of Soiga, said to have been read by John Dee and never again understood by mortal eyes. The Picatrix, veiled in Arabic astrology and coded ritual, whispered to grant dominion over spirits. Even the Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible, its legends murmur that the scribe who wrote it did so in a single night, after striking a deal he could never unmake. Each of these books is a question with no safe answer. And maybe that's what makes them sacred, not for their power, but for their restraint. Because behind every forbidden book is someone who chose to look away, to close it, to walk out of the candlelit room and leave the rest unread. Maybe that's the final paradox of the Library of Shadows. That it's not the reading that changes you. It's the stopping. You think of that as you close your own book for the night. The air feels thicker now, like the words have seeped into it. Outside, the world is beginning to gray. And somewhere in the dark, a shelf creaks softly. Was that the sound of settling wood? Or did something move a page? You'll never know. You were never meant to.